Well, everyone, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining us today for our Future of Work lecture series, presented by the Applied Ethics Center at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. I am Alex Stubbs, a postdoctoral fellow in the philosophy department at UMass Boston and the IEET. And today we're happy to be joined by Darrell West. Darrell M. West is a senior fellow at the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution. His current research focuses on artificial intelligence, robotics, and the future of work. Dr. West is also director of the John Hazen White Manufacturing Initiative. Prior to joining Brookings, Dr. West taught political science and public policy at Brown University. His most recent books include Power Politics, Trump and the Assault on American Democracy, Turning Point, Policymaking in the Era of Artificial Intelligence, Divided Politics, Divided Nation, and The Future of Work, Robots, AI, and Automation, which dovetails nicely with the title of his talk for today, How Newly Emerging Technologies Affect the Future of Work. So, Darrell, thank you for joining us today, and I will pass the spotlight over to you.
Okay, Alec, thank you very much. And James, I appreciate the invitation. It's a pleasure to be with you at UMass Boston. And I remember from my Brown University days, it was just down the road from where you are. I appreciate the invitation, and I think it's a very timely subject because we know that we are living in a time of great transition. We are shifting to a digital economy. There actually is amazing innovation that's taking place. COVID accelerated a lot of innovation, and I think a number of those changes will be permanent features. So there's a lot of uncertainty about how to handle all the things that are taking place. So what I'd like to do today is talk about the impact of emerging technologies on the future of work. And I argue that the technology revolution is accelerating. And I think people are actually going to be shocked how quickly a lot of changes take place. So a lot of people think, you know, the internet has been around for more than 25 years. We've seen a lot of change already. But I think the pace of the revolution is actually going to accelerate because there are a lot of changes that are taking place simultaneously. So, for example, AI is really, I think, the transformative technology. It's being deployed in many different sectors, from healthcare and education to retail and national defense. Those changes are definitely going to accelerate. There's huge money, both from government and business, that's flowing into those areas. A lot of technology innovation actually gets fueled by war. And so the Ukraine conflict is encouraging the military to experiment with new technologies, put a lot of money into the hyperwar space. So we will see technologies that get deployed first in the military sector that may eventually migrate to some of our domestic areas. I don't know how many of you have been in some of the new Amazon stores that are fully automated, that basically have no cashiers. There are self-checkout lines. Basically, Amazon is using computer vision to keep track of what items you pick up. When you walk into the store, you basically scan your app. You walk out without meeting any human sales clerk. You're not scanning anything. It merely sees what you have picked up and automatically purchases your credit card or your mobile payment system. I believe Amazon is planning on rolling out over 3,000 of these over the next few years. There's actually one in DC just down the street from where I live. I've been there a few times, and it pretty much operates as advertised. There are no retail clerks, no cash registers. You walk in, get your items, and walk out, and then the bill appears on your system. So obviously, that's going to have consequences for sales clerks around the country. Virtual reality is emerging and being used in lots of interesting ways. One of the applications is for training purposes in law enforcement. I've actually seen simulations. One of my colleagues, Rashawn Ray, has a lab at the University of Maryland where he basically brings police officers in, gives them a headset, walks them through different types of situations that a police officer is likely to encounter, a domestic disturbance, a robbery, and a variety of other things. And you can basically have the police officer look at these situations and have to react and make a decision. Does the police officer shoot or not shoot? Does the police officer engage in behavior that tones down the conflict and is able to resolve it? And all of this is on tape. So after the simulation, you can basically go back, talk with the police officer and ask why he or she made the decisions that were made, and kind of reflect on, was that the right decision? Was it not the right decision? So that's just one application among many that are starting to emerge in the virtual reality area. And of course, one of the most recent technologies is generative AI. I'm sure all of you have been reading and hearing a lot about ChatGPT that OpenAI has put forward. Google has its system called Bard. There are a bunch of other companies that are putting out other such systems. All of these applications are using large language models to generate text, images, code, or many other things. Basically, it's an interactive interface, so you can ask for certain things, and the applications have the ability to do many of them. They kind of vary a lot in how sophisticated they are and the kind of tasks that they can do, but there is a lot of new implementations that are emerging there. And one of the things that's really noteworthy is it's a major change in usability because it brings advanced technology to non-specialists and allows people like us to do things that we previously could not do and that we would not have the technical capabilities to do. It's kind of like in the early days of website development, like you had to learn HTML code, so that was a limiting factor for a lot of people. But today, most sites have moved to templates where basically you're cutting and pasting or importing pictures into a website template, and voila, the website then adds those things. So we're kind of at a similar stage, but with more sophisticated applications. So people can write software code even though they're not coders. They can develop apps even though they're not app developers. So all of that, of course, is going to raise interesting ramifications for the workforce. So when you think about all these developments, AI, automated stores, virtual reality, generative AI, quantum computing is starting to take off. It's like all these revolutions are taking place simultaneously. Like any one of them would actually be quite formidable, especially in terms of the potential workforce ramifications. But when you have, 6 to 12 big things taking place simultaneously, that is a revolution. And so I think we should not underestimate the scope and depth of the changes that could come out of this. So when I think about it, I often like to think about how these developments create both opportunities and risks. So there certainly are a lot of workforce opportunities that are going to emerge from these new technologies. The good news is there's a possibility we may all be able to work fewer hours if we choose to, because there will be automated tools that can do at least the repetitive parts of each of our jobs. Like, regardless of what kind of job you have, there's some mix of repetitive and manual and then more creative tasks. All these automated tools very soon, if they're not already doing it, are going to be able to replicate the repetitive and manual stuff that you're doing. And so the good news scenario is perhaps these tools will relieve us of the boring and mundane jobs. There are machines and robots that may relieve us of dangerous jobs, like when nuclear power plants melt down and we need to measure the radioactivity levels in those plants, instead of sending humans in who then 5 years down the road get cancer, we now send robots in with cameras and with sensors, and you can look and measure different things. So machines can do some of the dangerous tasks that humans currently are doing. What a lot of young people want today is a better work-life balance. They often have hobbies or outside interests, art, music, culture, theater, sports, whatever. They're looking for jobs that give them a better balance than perhaps people of my generation had. And so the hope is that the technology may make many people better off and put us in a position where we have more creative tasks in our jobs, less dangerous tasks in our jobs, and more time to pursue outside interests that people have. But of course, there also are a number of risks, and there's no guarantee that this optimistic scenario that I just laid out actually is going to come to pass. There's a great risk that many people are going to end up being left behind by these digital developments. I mean, we've already seen a rise in inequality over the last 40 years, which is not due entirely to technology, but technology is part of that story. And when you look around the world at countries that have a high level of inequality, you almost always see a lot of social unrest, a lot of crime, a lot of violence, and political turmoil. So it's not a happy picture in countries that have very high levels of inequality. And in the United States, our level of inequality has actually risen quite substantially over the last 4 decades. So obviously, we're not at the point of Venezuela or Iraq or some other countries in the developing world, but we're actually closer than probably a lot of people imagine. Another thing that I worry about personally is geographic disparities. There often is a mismatch between geography and economic output. I had some colleagues in our Metro program at Brookings who did an analysis, and they found that 15% of US counties generate over 70% of our gross domestic product. My colleagues Mark Miro and Sifan Liu did this analysis. And what that means is, for all practical purposes, a lot of America's economic activity is on the East Coast, the West Coast, and then a few metropolitan areas in between. But much of the country actually is being left behind. And of course, this is exactly what elected Trump in 2016. You know, we're in a situation where many are feeling like they're not sharing in the prosperity. They feel like they're being left behind. And this is not merely a perception. It actually is a reality. And things might actually get worse in the future as opposed to better. Because if you look at venture capital investments, which to some degree is a predictor of future economic activity, 3/4 of venture capital money today is going to 3 states, California, New York, and Massachusetts. So the VC money is very highly targeted from a geographic standpoint. And so there's a risk that our current geographic disparities, which already are quite strong and quite significant, could actually get worse as some of these new technologies develop. So, you know, as a country, we definitely need to think about geography, and we need to think about how to build more broadly based tech investment that kind of brings more people along. COVID has aggravated a lot of these trends. On the one hand, it accelerated technology innovation. It shifted what might otherwise have been 5 years of technological change into 5 months. You know, we had a shift to online learning, telemedicine, e-commerce, and remote work. Not all of these changes are going to be permanent changes on the landscape, but a number of them probably will be. People like the convenience of online shopping. That is likely to keep increasing in the future. A lot of jobs have become hybrid. Like at Brookings, we're kind of half in the office and half at home. So it's not clear that a lot of workplaces are ever going to go back to the old model of basically be in the office 4 or 5 days a week. You know, people kind of want a different type of situation. And when you think about kind of the broader societal situation in which we exist with all these technological changes unfolding, the level of economic and social anxiety is likely to increase in coming decades. People are worried about technology. We can see that in public opinion surveys. Of course, their anxiety is fueled by Hollywood, which loves to put out movies of killer robots and superhuman beings that eventually enslave humanity. A lot of people can see, you know, the negative consequences that technology already is bringing, the threats to jobs and so on. And so in that situation, people often look for scapegoats. They worry about how these changes are going to affect them, how it's going to affect the lives of their children. And it's not just the technology, like business models have shifted along with the technology. And so a lot of companies have moved to temporary workers, independent contractors, basically paying people money to do a job, but not providing benefits. that business model has become prevalent in a number of different sectors. So there you have a combination of technology interacting with the business models in ways that aggravate inequality, create winners and losers in the society, and create a number of other negative types of consequences. So I think when you look at all those things taken together, there are likely to be substantial impact on politics, our economy, and society as a whole. From a workforce development standpoint, there's likely to be more job churn, meaning movement of people from company to company and job to job. I often like to tell people I've been very fortunate in my adult life. I basically have had two employers. So I taught political science and public policy at Brown University for 26 years. Then I moved to DC. I've been at Brookings for the last 15 years. So I basically had two employers. When I talk to young people, I tell them their experience is not going to be like that at all. Like they're likely to have 7, 8, 9, or 10 different jobs during the course of their lifetime. They're going to move across companies. They will likely move across sectors. There's just going to be more volatility in their experience. There are going to be possible job losses as well when you start thinking about the incorporation of technology and automation into different sectors. So I gave the example of the fully automated Amazon retail outlets and just what that means for sales clerks. Like sales clerk is a major entry-level position for many Americans. It's a sector that employs a number of different people. In the future, we may end up needing a lot fewer of those people because stores are either moving to that fully automated model that we see with Amazon, or there are a bunch of stores where I shop where basically they have developed kiosks and customers self-scan their own items. You know, I go to the supermarket and we see that. You go to Target or Walmart, you see that. So some of the very large companies that have had difficulty finding workers since COVID basically are just automating those jobs. And as that type of innovation and business model spreads, you know, that's going to be really bad for those entry-level jobs. The restaurant sector is another entry-level position where there is some automation coming in. You know, it used to be I'd go into a restaurant, there'd be a waiter or waitress who would come over, you place your order, they bring you your food, and then at some point you pay the check. Some parts of that process now is being automated. You know, sometimes you walk in and basically they have you scan the menu and then you use that electronic version of the menu to place your own order. And then the waiter or waitress will bring the food to you, but that's the only part that they're really responsible for. And then the bill paying part is also being automated. So if you think about kind of the 4 or 5 parts of a waiter's job, half of those, if not more than half of those, already are being automated. That's going to have big consequences for that. The autonomous vehicle area has been an area that has unfolded more slowly than what was anticipated a few years ago, but we will, in the very near future, start to see automated cars and trucks in selected areas. Like particularly long distance driving is an area where companies already are experimenting with autonomous trucks. The taxi cab and ride sharing business also is an area where autonomous vehicles are being deployed. So I don't anticipate this is going to be a mass consumer item anytime soon where you will be buying a fully autonomous vehicle. But in some of these specialty areas of truck driving, taxi driving, and ride sharing services, there are going to be automated vehicles there. So again, that's going to have ramifications for the workers in those areas. Now, we often like to think that automation is going to have an impact on entry-level jobs, but people like us who are part of the knowledge sector, have advanced degrees, that we will be immune to that. And we are deluding ourselves if we think that, because we already are seeing AI applications that can read CAT scans and X-rays with a very high degree of accuracy, almost not quite to the level of a human radiologist, but just a few percentage points lower. There have been peer-reviewed articles in Science that have demonstrated the accuracy of AI reading these CAT scans. So if I was a radiologist, I'd be pretty nervous, because what the AI has done is, if you categorize images, an X-ray or a CAT scan, as showing cancer or not showing cancer, and you feed that AI system 10,000 images, that system will be able, with a very high degree of accuracy, to distinguish a CAT scan that shows cancer versus one that does not. Now, hospitals are not trusting AI themselves, so what they're doing is they use the AI as like a first screen, and then if something looks problematic, then they will take that CAT scan or that X-ray to a human radiologist to confirm the AI diagnosis. But that's just an illustration of how even advanced fields like radiology are going to be affected. Accounting and finance is an area where there's a lot of technology that is coming in. It turns out that when you're dealing with money, it's actually pretty easy to automate that. Like there are wealth managers that are developing AI applications because it turns out AI is more rational and less emotional than human investors, which turns out to be a very good quality when you're managing your money. And so you can just kind of go sector by sector, and the technology is creeping in, even in more advanced areas where people might not expect technology to run the risk of displacing humans, but it is going to come. So when we kind of look at the current transition to a digital economy, this is not the first time that we have experienced what I like to call mega change, kind of large-scale transformation. If you go back 100 years ago, America was undergoing a similar large-scale transformation from agriculture to an industrial world. If you look at the period from like the 1890s through the 1930s, there was a lot of disruption. There were a lot of people who were affected. There were farmers who were losing jobs because their manual labor was being replaced by machines. There were large-scale factories that were being set up that had automated production lines. So there was a lot of change that kind of transformed the workplace. In some ways, in good ways, higher wages and steady jobs. In other respects, replacing jobs that used to exist and that used to employ a large number of people. But the critical thing about industrialization is we actually had a public policy change in response to those workplace disruptions. During this time period, 100 years ago, we developed Social Security to help older people. We developed unemployment insurance. We broke up the monopolies, railroads and Standard Oil, in order to make sure there was some competition in the marketplace. We adopted the income tax, through a constitutional amendment, because as the government was starting to expand its role in overseeing industry, it needed more money, and so it needed a new revenue source. So there was a new tax that was developed. And of course, the history of the income tax is a long and complicated one in the sense that it took like 30 years for that policy idea to get implemented into law. It was passed by Congress. It was then invalidated by courts. And then Congress basically had to amend the Constitution to actually put it into effect. So I like to remind people today, there are policy reforms that we need to be thinking about now. And it may take 20 or 30 years to actually get them implemented, but we need to start the work now. Because even though the political will in our political system is not ready for large-scale changes in our social contract, we have to start developing the ideas that can address this transition to a digital economy now, so that over the next 10, 20, and 30 years, when political conditions change, that those ideas can get implemented. So there is a lot of effort going in now in terms of how we renegotiate our social contract. The same thing is happening in terms of governance models, because 100 years ago, there actually were a number of political reforms that were developed. The whole idea of a presidential primary to bypass the party bosses was created then. Women got the right to vote, so we were expanding the right to vote, referenda, the direct election of senators. There were a lot of political reforms during that time period as well. So industrialization had a very interesting combination of policy changes with governance changes that then allowed the country to adapt to industrialization, help workers ease the transition to the new type of economy that was emerging. And so what I like to tell people now is we're at a similarly transformative moment of moving from an industrial to a digital world. We're going to need policy changes and governance changes that allow us to cope with this, that help workers deal with the disruptions that we can already see them facing, and that they're probably going to face even more dramatically over the next 5 years. And I'll just throw out a few ideas, and obviously happy to talk in greater detail about any of these. But we need to put a greater emphasis on portable benefits, because I argued earlier that as a result of technology changes in business models and other things, there's going to be more job churn, people moving from job to job. In that situation, we need benefits that are portable as well, because today, for example, our healthcare and our retirement benefits often are tied to a job. And so when you move from one job to another, you may move from one medical network to a different medical network. How people handle that transition while still preserving a high quality of medical care is an important thing. On retirement benefits, many companies have a probation period, like you have to be at the company for a year or sometimes 2 years before you qualify for retirement benefits. Now, in my case, since I had 2 employers, that was not a big deal. But if people are moving across companies and they end up having 7, 8, 9, or 10 different jobs, if you have to go through a 2-year probation period before you qualify for retirement benefits, and you have to do that 10 times, like that is going to matter for the retirement benefits that people are going to need in that situation. So making benefits portable so that when you're moving from job to job, you're not suffering a loss of healthcare, a loss of retirement benefits, a loss of disability insurance, et cetera, et cetera. That becomes very important. A second part of the new social contract that we need to think about is a need for lifelong learning. Like today, much of our education model is based on helping people up through about the age of 25. We invest a lot in K-12, we invest in higher education, but pretty much after 25, or maybe 30 for some people, people are basically on their own to figure it out. Like if you need to upskill, if you need to develop a new skill to either keep a job or to get a job, it's basically on you to figure out how to do that. And of course, you have to pay for that. The interesting question going forward is we're going to be in a time period where people are going to have to upskill their individual situations at ages 30, 40, 50, and 60. Basically, throughout their lifetimes, they are going to have to develop new skills. Because the flip side of losing jobs through technology is there are going to be new types of jobs that are created, but we have to make sure people have the skills to qualify for those new jobs. There are going to be new jobs that we don't even envision today that are going to end up being created, but K-12 and higher ed isn't necessarily training people for those jobs because in some cases they don't exist yet, and we don't even know what skills will be required. So lifelong learning is going to be a big part of the challenge, and the question is going to be who pays for that. Like with K-12, there's kind of a societal agreement that we collectively pay for that. In higher ed, the federal government and state governments put money into financial aid and research and development and providing support for colleges and universities. So there's kind of a general agreement that there needs to be public support for higher ed. But then this whole adult education model is still emerging, and we basically have not defined that by and large as something that somebody else has to pay for because it's important for society. So kind of figuring out how to develop this adult education piece, what role public support for that is going to play is going to be important. We need to start having those conversations today. There's some companies that already are providing professional development for their workers. So, if you need to take an online class to get a skill, or if you need to go through a certificate program to get a skill, there are companies that will pay for that. So that's kind of an easy solution. But yet, that's the same problem that we have with healthcare, that in making professional development dependent on having a job, we are excluding the people who don't have jobs or the people who are between jobs. And that group of people who are between jobs is going to increase as we move more and more into a digital economy because of that job churn notion that I was talking about earlier. So figuring out how we handle adult education, and perhaps more importantly, who's going to pay for it, that's a conversation we need to have. And by the way, in the 2024 presidential election, you should not expect to hear any of the candidates talking about that. Even though we should be talking about it, it's not at the point where we're really having a national conversation about it. And by the way, America is different from some European countries. I've spoken at some conferences in Europe where other countries are actually having these conversations now. When they have political races, candidates are discussing and debating how to do it. And some people want more public investment. Some people want to rely more on private sector companies to provide the adult education, but they're actually having those conversations. In America, we're actually not having those conversations, but it's the type of conversation that we do need to handle. So the advice that I have for young people today is they are going to have multiple jobs, and at some point they will be in a situation where they may not have access to healthcare and or retirement benefits. It's going to be difficult and challenging for them. They're going to end up with more numbers and types of jobs than I had when I was growing up. And so all that is going to be a challenge. And one of my favorite insights actually comes from Charles Darwin, the famous student of evolution, who argued that survival goes not to the strongest or the most intelligent, but the most adaptable. When he was studying different species and how they evolved, he found that the species that were most successful were the ones that were adaptable, because there are lots of changes that affect every species. Climate changes, environmental changes, the impact of humans on plants and animals. The ones that actually did well were those that were adaptable. And so I tell young people today that as we're making this transition to a digital economy, there are new types of skills that are going to be required. Persistence, resilience, adaptability. I mean, these are all soft skills. As we're thinking about the transition to a digital economy, we often think about the technical skills or the hard skills, like who can code, who can develop software, who knows how to run an app, today, who can do generative AI, et cetera, and those are all important things as we make the transition to a digital economy. But how to encourage young people to be adaptable, to be persistent, to be resilient in the face of a lot of uncertainty and a lot of volatility that they are going to experience is also going to be very important. And kind of figuring out, like in higher education, how you train people to become resilient, like that's not an easy task. It's easy to think about how you train people on chemistry or how you train people on biology, but how do you train persistence? How do you train adaptability? How do you train resilience? These are important qualities, and so we all need to be thinking about how we can convey those qualities to the next generation. The last point that I'll make, and that I'll be happy to take any questions or comments that you have, is one of our biggest challenges in this transition to a digital economy is going to be cultural. So it's not political or economic, it's cultural, in the sense of what I call attributions of responsibility. America has been a very individualistic type of country where the cultural expectation is personal responsibility. Like, you are responsible for your economic well-being, your education level, how well you end up doing. If you fail, it's because you haven't worked hard, you haven't put enough effort in, you haven't taken online classes, you haven't developed new skills. This emphasis on personal responsibility, I think, is going to be problematic in the transition to a digital economy, because there are going to be people who are left behind, not because they're not working hard, or not because they're not smart, or not because they're not getting a college education. They're not going to do well just because of these big structural changes that are affecting them. The technology changes, the changes in business model, changes in our political system, changes in governance, changes in geopolitics. Like there are crazy changes at the global level that are taking place: Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Ukraine, and so on, all of which will at some point have consequences for American workers. So we're going to need to think about how to move culturally from a sense of responsibility that places all of the onus for how well you do on the individual to a more general sense of responsibility, kind of a social sense of responsibility, where we're responsible for one another. Like we develop the idea that an individual is not going to be successful if the society as a whole is doing poorly. And again, to come back to that inequality notion, when you look around the world, countries that have a very high level of inequality are violent, conflictual, and oftentimes authoritarian places. So you as an individual in the digital economy may be able to do perfectly well. You may develop that combination of hard and soft skills that will lead to great success. But if you're living in a country that is conflictual, violent, and authoritarian, that may not be such a good social contract for you. And so we need to think about how to develop a social sense of responsibility where we're actually all in this together. And it's not just, who can make the most money and who can end up having the best job, but how can we develop a society that's working for most of the people and that we're not leaving too many people behind. So that's what I worry about kind of on a big picture basis. So why don't I stop at that point? Be happy to take any comments or any questions, or if you want to argue about any of these points, happy to do that as well.
Okay, thank you, Darrell, so much. Really appreciate the talk. So, yeah, as some folks have done already, please use the raise hand feature, and we can go that way. So, Steve, your hand has been up several times throughout, so I think you've got a couple questions. So, why don't you kick us off?
Well, I just wanted to thank you so much, Darrell, for your presentation. I haven't read your books, and I just looked at the titles of them there. So you're talking about a lot of very current things. Your most recent books are about the political divisions going on. And I was going to raise, before you raised it, in the last part of your presentation, is that it seemed that a lot of your policy prescriptions are kind of premised on this individualistic sense that we have here in the United States and how we normally go about policy. And I was thinking about Hillary Clinton way back in the 90s, talking about the symbolic analysts at the top of the pyramid of knowledge. And the US would be presumptively always at the cutting edge of knowledge. And therefore we would allow our education system to allow for US workers to always be at the top and, have policies that would allow them to get the best jobs. And, that at that point in time, we were the sole hegemon in the world, and our technological supremacy was unquestioned. As you were saying, we're having geopolitical rivalry right now where that technological supremacy may come under threat. So that assumption of like trying to move people up to that top of the pyramid, in my opinion, is problematic. It's also problematic given the rise of the AI that it can potentially displace these symbolic workers, which of course Hillary Clinton back in the day didn't have any idea was going to be coming onto the scene. So a part of what you left out of the talk was a lot of what people are talking about in terms of universal basic income. This may fall under this idea of trying to create a social sense of responsibility. The taxation, I suppose, of these new technologies in a way that would allow for potentially the inevitable permanent displacement of people. So in other words, previous technological revolutions increased jobs, even though there are people who were worried about their jobs being displaced. They actually increased jobs because there were different kinds of jobs created throughout the economy in unforeseen ways. Of course I could be wrong, I do not believe that's the case this time. I believe there will be permanent displacement of jobs and positions. So the way to think about this now is how do we simultaneously disallow for the aggregation of wealth to further accumulate to large corporations who will be using these technologies, and how do we, potentially tax the robots? I mean, there are proposals out there to do such things, but so what are your thoughts upon the possibility of permanent displacement, which I think is more likely in this revolution than in previous things?
I think those are all great points. Let me address them in the reverse order that you mentioned them. So you ended up with the jobs question, and I think you're exactly right. when I did my Future of Work book, I actually looked at the number of workers that Apple, Google, and Facebook had. And you're right that if you go back to the 1960s and look at General Motors and AT&T, like industries provided a bunch of jobs, and they were actually pretty good paying jobs. And so we had a very strong middle class. People could, work in the factory and still have enough money to send their kids to college. Today, the new digital platforms, because they are able to scale up due to software and now applications, don't actually need that many workers. So, and these numbers are a few years out of date, but I think notionally they are still in the right direction. Apple at that point only had 123,000 employees. Google had 80,000. Facebook only had 25,000. And so your point that large-scale job losses is definitely a scenario we need to think about, because these companies are creating tremendous wealth, but actually not very many jobs. And of course, in the last year, the people they have hired, they're now laying off. So that problem is getting worse. The second point you raised was the tax question. And I do think that's a significant one that we need to be thinking about, in the sense that just as we made the transition from an agrarian to an industrial world, the need for tax revenues actually went up during that time period. And so our leaders came up with the idea of an income tax, which had been briefly evoked during the Civil War by Lincoln, but it was a temporary income tax to basically finance the war. But our policymakers realized that the role of the federal government was expanding. The role of the U.S. internationally was expanding early in the 20th century, and we basically just needed more money to deal with that. I think we're at a similar inflection point now in the transition to a digital economy, in the sense that it's going to cost money to think about adult education, worker retraining, professional development, like all the workforce-related issues that Steve mentioned and that I mentioned in various parts of my talk. It's going to cost money. But we need to have a sense of social responsibility where we don't view that as wasted money on our part, but rather an investment in other people and an investment in society that will actually make our lives better, because we'll have a calmer, less conflictual, and less violent country.
But
so I think
I did want to make the distinction between the upgrading. So that would be a Hillary Clinton argument, right? So we upgrade, people are going to be displaced more often. We figure out how to have lifelong learning. We create a tax provision that allows for the money to do that. I agree that'll be important ultimately as we go through these transitions, but it doesn't address the permanent displacement. So I guess what I'm saying is, look at the trade adjustment assistance programs. They don't work, right? So with all the offshoring and outsourcing, a lot of that stuff is wasted money. And you guys have even done studies on that. That's been wasted money thrown down the drain. They simply, the trade adjustment system doesn't work. So the idea is that I think in this particular situation, we could end up training certain displaced workers for job A, and then job A is more easily done by ChatGPT 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 down the line, and then you also put money down the sinkhole of irrelevance. So the idea is maybe, I think learning is important, for the point of human development. Like lifelong learning is important for people just to feel good about themselves or to learn more skills, whether or not they'll be utilized in terms of a wage relationship. So I think it's important, but I think we need to plan for the possibility of permanent displacement. So, you're still appear to be working under the assumption of like the Hillary Clinton, let's stay at the top of the kind of, let's, make our workforce dynamic and adaptable, because the United States is a dynamic and adaptable. And, let's just get those workers into the best positions that are available. I think that this revolution, we need to at least keep open the possibility that displacement will be permanent. So how do we deal with that? A UBI? Do we deal with taxing the robots to, create a UBI? What's your thoughts about universal basic income?
Well, this is the point that I was going to address. It was your first point and my third point, the UBI argument. And I would not characterize my position the way you described the position to me. So let me talk about the UBI, because there certainly are going to be people who, even with workforce development, adult education, and professional development, aren't going to have jobs. And the question is how we deal with them. And that's part of the social responsibility part of this, that we need to figure out how to have an inclusive economy that helps everybody, because if we end up with high levels of income inequality, we're not going to like the society in which we live. at that point. UBI is one of the proposals that has been developed to deal with that workforce displacement argument. But people should keep in mind there actually are two versions of UBI that are out there, one liberal and one conservative. The liberal version of UBI is basically workers get to keep the federal benefits that currently exist in terms of welfare benefits, child care benefits, transportation benefits, and a variety of other things. And that UBI, some guaranteed income, and the exact level varies a lot from proposal to proposal, but a common one would be, let's say, give people $2,000 a year, $24,000, give people $2,000 a month, or give them $3,000 a month, which would be $36,000, and that they would get that money on top of all the social benefits. But people should understand there are conservatives who basically support UBI, but their model is the $2,000 or $3,000 a month is instead of a lot of the government benefits. So don't be sucked into UBI without asking the question, like, which version of UBI are we talking
I know this.
about?
I know
And
this.
what I would like to argue is we're in a dynamic situation in terms of the economy, and it's not clear to me that we know which policy ideas are going to work, whether the liberal version of UBI is the way to go, the conservative version is the way to go, or there are a bunch of other proposals that are out there on how we handle this displacement issue. What I think we should be doing is experimentation at the state and local level with very rigorous policy evaluation attached to it so that we can figure out what works and what does not work. And by the way, this is happening, like Stockton, California did an experiment with UBI, and they actually found very positive results that if you provide cash to people on a monthly basis, people actually develop a higher level of security, and they're not kind of living as much on the edge. There are European countries that are experimenting with a variety of things. So what I would argue is I think all of us should be humble about what our favorite policy remedies should be, because in a situation where there's so many changes taking place, even if an idea worked 10 or 20 years ago, there's no guarantee it's going to work going forward. We need that experimentation combined with policy evaluation to figure out what's going to work given the economy that is unfolding right now.
Great. So thanks, Steve. So let's go ahead and I'll toss it to Barry, who's had his hand up for a while.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'd like to throw out the topics of neurodiversity and disability. I'll try to keep my question brief. I was going to ask about them anyway, but you were saying that we need people who have the qualities of persistence, resilience, and adaptability. Anybody who is surviving with a disability certainly has persistence and resilience down, and likely is also having to be adaptable just because of all the nonsense, government red tape and stuff like that, that gets thrown at people in those situations. So especially as we are going towards a digital economy where not just those qualities, but just skills in dealing with things that don't have to do with people come to the forefront. And that's something that comes up with neurodiversity. There seems to be a lot of opportunity there. On the flip side, if the people who are driving these innovations are people who are much better at dealing with the digital world than the personal world, then you have a lot going on. I could name people who are doing this today at a certain mass telecommunication company that just got acquired, who don't really seem to be taking people into the picture. So instead of having these developments driven just by wealth, the pursuit of wealth like the robber barons, you also have people whose ideas don't necessarily include what most people would think of as normal life. So I'm wondering if you could comment on all of that.
Well, there's several different parts of that question. It's a very interesting question. The last thing that you mentioned, the people part of it, and the inequality part that we're seeing very dramatically these days is really problematic. I mean, I think the older I get, the more I worry about inequality as a structural factor that is just creating other sorts of problems, including some of our governance problems as well. So 100 years ago, when we also had a very high level of inequality, competition policy and antitrust enforcement was a big part of the policy response. Like breaking up the railroads, breaking up Standard Oil were both important components. Today, we are seeing a lot of consolidation, mergers and acquisitions happening all the time, not just in the digital space, but in virtually every other sector as well. I mean, we're pretty much in a situation where in most sectors, there are 2 or 3 dominant providers, and we just need stronger regulation and stronger antitrust enforcement than what we see now. A few years ago, I looked at, there's a database that the Department of Justice keeps on mergers and acquisitions, and at that point, it was something like 96 to 97% of mergers and acquisitions were approved by the Department of Justice, meaning basically every merger is being approved. It is the exception. You know, there are a handful of highly publicized exceptions to that, but they're kind of in the 2, 3, or 4% category, not the 96 or 97%. You mentioned the particular category of people who are disabled and how they are going to handle this transition, and the question of adaptability and what we can do for those individuals. There's some aspects of technology that can be helpful to those individuals, like you know, there's software packages for the visually impaired who can basically convert text to audio and basically make it possible for people to quote unquote read a document or a web page that they otherwise would not be able to see. They're going to be brain technology interfaces that help. And James told me earlier that one of the next topics you're going to be looking at is actually that question. And I pointed out to him kind of before we started, that technology is actually advancing more rapidly than what people imagine. And it's actually advancing for the disabled. So there are people who have hearing impairments now that are basically getting brain implants that allow them to hear. Like, that's a great development. But it also has the consequence of kind of making those types of interfaces more acceptable to people. And one can imagine problematic applications of that technology down the road. So I do think we're at an interesting time period, both from the wealth standpoint as well as how all this is going to affect specialized populations and what our policy response needs to be in order to help those people.
Okay, so you're talking about helping the disabled and the neurodiverse. I'm talking about those categories as those people as having the qualities that you are saying we're going to need as we transition into the digital economy. So it's not just a question of, oh, we can finally help these people. Are we finally going to use these people as resources?
Well, we're helping them to become useful resources. Like, if you are visually impaired and there's technology that can qualify you for jobs that otherwise you would not get hired to make, like, that's going to be a significant advance.
Sure, but if you've got these systems that nobody can figure out, and you've got someone, because he thinks differently, can figure them out, but society's putting all these obstacles in this person's way to get into the workforce, are we going to recognize the opportunity there?
Well, I hope so, but so far, based on the available evidence, we do a very poor job of that right now.
Okay.
So Jay and then Ren.
So I assume you agree that industrial policy seems to be having a bit of a renaissance as a concept in DC. And
Yes.
two of your observations, or one of your observations and one of my own, made me think about what your thoughts might be about industrial policy in this regard. First is the geographic problem. I just saw a great video about the EU, and it compared like the average income in Bulgaria to Luxembourg. And of course, if you have one labor market, everybody's going to move from the place where they don't make any money to the place where they make a lot of money. It would be great for us to get a bunch of Brooklyn to move to Idaho for political pragmatism reasons in the United States, but the prospect of that seems low unless we have a really, really aggressive industrial policy. So I'm just wondering if you had thoughts about ways of geographical rebalancing within the United States through that. But the second part of that is that one of the unaddressed reasons that we've seen the political instability that we've had is the focus on meritocracy and the higher education income dividend that people get for having degrees. The assumption that technology was having a skill-biased effect on inequality, that it was taking out the jobs in the middle and leaving the creatives at the top and the manual workers at the bottom. That's one of the hypotheses. I don't know if you endorse that or not, but a kind of auteur hypothesis. And now we're seeing that maybe the jobs at the top are also vulnerable. So we may just have jobs at the bottom for a while at any rate. But this resentment about the higher education seems to be at the root of a lot of the culture war and a lot of the political division, the growing support of higher educated people for the Democrats and vice versa for the Republicans and so on. So that seems like a more intractable part of this whole policy dimension to me. I don't know how we create greater equality. I can understand taking away the wealth of the billionaires, and I'm all for that, and redistributing it to everybody else through UBI. But I'm not sure that would address the kind of status basis of the inequalities that exist in our society.
I mean, I do worry about the geographic inequalities just because there is a direct link between those disparities and political populism. Like when large segments of our country are being left behind, they are pissed off and they're looking for scapegoats. And in my mind, they actually picked the wrong scapegoats. So they're not getting the policy remedies that actually are going to help solve the problem. But I think that on the geographic allocation of money, we just need to be more intentional about that. Tomorrow at Brookings, we're actually having a webinar on the federal acquisitions and procurement process. So our country has like a $6.5 trillion budget. 10% of that budget, $665 billion, goes to external contractors every year. And I forget the exact number, but it's almost 2/3 of that federal money. That $665 billion goes to 12 states, which are basically East Coast states, West Coast states, a couple of southern states that have big military installations. You know, the other 38 states are basically getting no federal money. And to me, that's an illustration of exactly what you're talking about. Like, we just need to realize that we're investing a lot of money government-wise in the economy, but we're doing it in a very concentrated way. So we need to figure out ways to spread that money out in a fairer way than we do now. The other part of that, in terms of like the coder and kind of wanting people to move to Idaho, the funny thing about COVID and remote work is that model actually now is possible. Like, you don't have to live in Seattle to work for Amazon. You don't have to live on the East Coast or the West Coast to be employed by one of these digital platforms. You actually can live in Idaho and do the job. So the question is, to what degree this introduction of remote work becomes a more permanent feature, and does it then help us address this geographic issue? And I think the answer to that really depends on education and professional development. Like, if the person in Idaho is getting the skills that the East Coast and the West Coast companies need, then they are going to end up getting hired. But, you know, we have to have fairness in the education system and the training system so that, you know, it doesn't aggravate the geographic disparities that we're talking about.
Great. Ren.
Thank you so much. Just to go back a little bit when we're talking about geographic disparities, although some of these innovations in theory could create additional opportunities for people to move to more rural areas, if we take it back to that conversation about individuals from already marginalized communities, so when we're talking about people with disabilities who maybe can't drive. I'm legally blind, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed for those self-driving cars that someday I will not be totally dependent on public transit and can maybe move out of a city into a space where I have more autonomy and independence without relying on that. But additionally, I mean, across the US, we're seeing substantial laws attacking transgender, non-binary, LGBTQ individuals. How are they supposed to move to a rural space outside of, one of the states that protects them, or even stay in these rural areas if they're going to be denied access to medical care, discriminated against in whether or not they can use the restroom or whether or not they can be a teacher? I think a lot of these things, although I always appreciate having these conversations, I do wonder, how many of those marginalized people are being included in these conversations about these technological advancements, and how often are their needs, and as the people who are going to, frankly, likely need these innovations as more so than, a higher income, well-educated individual who already has more income, and a little more freedom. What do we do to include their voices? Because what I'm seeing is a disproportionate number of individuals who already have access being able to then have primary access to these innovations, and a further, like a larger gap happening across the US in terms of access issues. So I wonder, how do we include their voices when we're considering these policy changes and considering how we're giving access to or creating these innovations that are supposed to help everyone?
Those are great points, and you're right. Right now, we're not doing a very good job on incorporating marginalized populations there. It's interesting, the point you made about autonomous vehicles. One of the strongest proponents of autonomous vehicles today in DC are disability rights organizations. Like, they are actually holding press conferences saying, we need to move forward with this. We need to stop the policy barriers, et cetera, et cetera. So that is an aspect of technology that I do believe will help that particular community. But on the broader point about how you bring technology innovation and technology benefits to marginalized populations, the gap between economic arguments and cultural arguments complicate that. The transgender person is not going to want to move to Idaho or any rural area, given the nature of those communities. I actually grew up on a dairy farm in rural Ohio, just north of Cincinnati, so I can appreciate that. I've gone back to my hometown once a year for the last 40 years, and I've seen all the changes that have taken place there. So it's hard to know how we can improve that situation, but the dominant trend now is technology is aggravating almost every aspect of inequality, income-wise, geography-wise, cultural aspects, political aspects, and so on. We can't let that be the norm going forward, because that is a path that puts us on a path towards authoritarianism. Because if that type of inequality continues, the only way you can have a peaceful society is through force. That is how other countries that basically have really high levels of inequality do it. Like, they almost always become authoritarian in a variety of different ways. So, there's the utopian scenario and there are dystopian scenarios. And when I was writing my book on AI a couple of years ago, I thought a lot about this question, and I really think, like, there aren't that many things that are either or questions, but I think this one actually is either or. We either end up in dystopia or we end up in some version of a utopia. Like, a middle level space there is probably a lower level probability than one of the more extreme versions. And obviously, I would prefer the utopian, not the dystopian version.
Thanks, Darrell. So I have a question if no one else has one. So, one of the things that I don't think you brought up, but I'm interested to hear your opinion on is where you place an emphasis, particularly in relation to the labor movement, thinking about the technological developments and particularly the issue of economic inequality. So, I'm thinking, a lot of the things that we're pointing to in terms of sort of a lack of benefits, lack of increasing in economic inequality is in large part due to the degradation of the labor movement over the past 50 years, which has been intentionally done through certain policy changes. So I want to get your opinion on what you think the role of the labor movement is in adapting to these technologies. How the labor movement can adapt to the differences that we're seeing here. And then also, maybe this is a leading question, but what then do you think are some of the main sites of political contestation that are going to result from the development of these kinds of technologies?
I think that's a great point. The major site of contestation on that issue is this whole notion of a full-time worker who gets a salary and benefits versus temporary workers and or independent contractors that get a salary but no benefits. Because I think the current level of unionization today is around 10%. So, it's a very low number. And you're right that there's a high correlation between declining unionization and increases in inequality and, some of the other things that we've been talking about. Technology is a big part of that problem in the sense that the tech sector has been very hard to organize. Now, in the last couple of years, we've actually seen a lot of efforts to organize people, Amazon and other places. It's been hard. There have been a few victories, but that 10% figure hasn't really shifted very much, even in the last few years. So, and one of the reasons why it's hard to organize tech spaces is the heavy reliance on temp workers and independent contractors there. And so, from my standpoint, it's not just making policy more amenable to unionization, but it's basically classifying more workers as real workers. Like if you are a FedEx driver, you wear a FedEx uniform, you drive a truck that has FedEx on the side, and you are delivering FedEx products, like you should be an employee of FedEx, like you are not an independent contractor. But so far, the courts have not ruled in that way. Most state legislatures and Congress has not passed policies in that direction. From my mind, like that is the factor that drives a number of these problems, not all of them, but it's a big part of it. And unless we can make progress on that aspect, your progress in labor organizing is not going to go very far.
Yeah, thank you. Jay.
I imagine that it comes up fairly often in your conversations about this in Brookings, that any effort to improve the condition of workers that makes labor more expensive is going to accelerate the process of automation. And I used to point to Germany as a society that showed that you could have your cake and eat it too, that you could have a high level of worker pay and worker rights and still have a high level of automation. I'm not so sure that that's true anymore. Do you worry about this? That
yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
No, you're exactly right. In places where labor costs are growing, that is a perfect formula for businesses to introduce even greater automation than they already have. COVID was an accelerant in that degree because COVID basically created labor issues and companies were very concerned about costs. There has been an increase in automation just in the last couple of years. And now that companies have discovered how many jobs and how many tasks can be automated, like it's encouraging them to add more things to the list. And as we mentioned earlier, it's not just entry-level jobs, like even in the knowledge sector, there are things that we do, generative AI already can do. And there in the future, probably more of our jobs will be able to be done by generative AI. So how we get a handle on that is going to be a big challenge going forward. The worry that I have is, as a country, we're really not discussing these issues, and we're falling behind other countries in not having a conversation about the things that actually matter 5 and 10 years down the road. So, I'll be watching the 2024 election to see if maybe some of these issues will break through, but so far I've seen very little evidence of that, and that's just putting us on a very terrible path if we're not even discussing the conversation, let alone taking action to address those issues.
Yeah.
Darrell, thank you so much for a really, really fascinating talk. One observation and one question. When you say that there needs to be more attention to continuing education, which I agree with, and figuring out who pays for that and under what model. Also, my sense is, and this follows up your point, that we're not discussing these questions as a country, just in the traditional higher education system. Almost all universities, with the exception of a few, are completely siloed between, for example, the engineering schools and the more humanities/social sciences concentration, such that the engineers who at this point have a greater influence on how we live than anybody else have a very kind of, shall we say, retrograde level of thinking about the social consequences of what they're doing. So there's a sort of, it seems to me there's both room and need for reform very much in the structure that already exists. And so I was wondering if you had thought about that. And then the other question is, since you gave us the super helpful overview of the impact of different technologies, one of the debates that Alec, Jay, and I have been having for a long time is whether the kind of concerns and questions that we have with the rise of each new technology are just variations on older concerns that we had with the rise of old technologies, or whether there are some technologies, the technology du jour being ChatGPT, which introduce a qualitative change, where the questions that we asked in the past are no longer relevant. So I guess my second question is, are there, in your view, some recent technologies which are an absolute sort of qualitative leap, or is this still sort of, either death or utopia by 1,000 cuts?
I think what is unique about the current time period and qualitatively different from earlier periods of innovation is we basically have at least 10 different revolutions taking place simultaneously. Like, if it was just AI, it would be a different conversation about the future than, like, what we have now is basically revolutions in AI, genetics, quantum computing, generative AI, social media, and other types of things, all happening simultaneously. And I would not be so worried about our ability to handle this from a governance standpoint and a public policy standpoint if it was one revolution as opposed to 10. But when you have so many changes taking place, and there are going to be interaction effects, and there are going to be cumulative effects that come out of that, I think people have no idea how fast these changes are going to unfold. Like, even on a 3 to 5 year time horizon, I do think the world is going to be substantially different 3 and 5 years from now than it is today, in terms of the innovations, in terms of the ramifications for governance, the ramifications for the economy and the workforce, the ramifications for how our political system operates. Like, social media encourages extremism. Technology is not the only source of polarization and extremism, but it is a substantial part of the problem, in my view. So what I worry about is the cumulative impact and the interactive impact of all these revolutions, and our poor ability to cope with them. The fact that we're not even having national conversations about hardly any of the issues that we've talked about today is really concerning to me. When I go to Norway, I've been to conferences there, like their government is sponsoring conferences on these very topics, and they've been doing it for several years, and they're trying to figure out what their policy response should be. We're not doing that. And that's where we're going to fall behind. And our individualistic political culture is going to make it difficult, I think, to adopt this kinds of solutions that are going to be necessary to actually deal with these problems.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think we're at about time, unless anybody has any final questions for Darrell. On that very cheery note, Darrell, hopefully that we end up in the utopian rather than dystopian position. So, but we very much thank you for being with us today and discussing these really important issues with us.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed the conversation with you. Great questions, and good luck as you continue to grapple with these questions.
Thank you, Jay. I think you have a final thought.
Just to remind people that we will have another talk in this series. We have one scheduled for May 3rd, Phil Gent from the UK. So stay tuned. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Darrell.
Thank you.
Great.